ready?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Julia O'Brien. I'm the professor of Old Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary. So I'm really happy to be here in the room with the folks, but also to imagine those of you who are online that I can't see. And thank you for joining me for these 2 weeks where we're going to talk about reading the Bible for the sake of the planet. I want to start with my own premise, and that is that every generation always reads the Bible in light of its own concerns. We've always done that, and we know this from history. People always read the Bible asking questions about the things that matter to them most. And we know this. If you ever want to go into great detail sometime, I could show you how already in the Old Testament, some books are reinterpreting other books in light of new situations. But we also know it because we read the New Testament, and we know that the early Christians reinterpreted what they knew as Scripture. We know it as the Old Testament. They reinterpreted those passages from Isaiah and from Deuteronomy and from Genesis in light of their new experience of Jesus, to help them understand Jesus, to help them witness to Jesus. And if you've studied church history or even American history, you know that at different times and places, people have turned to the Bible and asked the question, what guidance does it have for this thing? So fill in the blank. Can women be ordained? What is women's role in life? What about food? What's the proper food that a person should eat? What about race? What does the Bible say about, at one point, it was a big deal, what does the Bible say about interracial marriage and the equality of the races? Gender, right? What is women's role? And we've watched it all within our own lifetimes, that as marriage equality became a large issue in our own world, people began to go back to the Bible and ask all over again, what does the Bible say about marriage? What does it say about sexuality in that way? So I think that that's always something worth noticing, that we do that. We do that because most of us believe, or at least want to believe, that the Bible has something to say to our lives. And that if this is going to be a text that's important to us, we're always going to bring the questions that we have in the moment. Right? I don't know if you share this assumption or not, but it is my premise for saying that in my own judgment, the most crucial crisis facing the planet is environmental devastation. In fact, I don't even use the word climate change anymore. I use the words climate crisis or climate catastrophe. Now, you might not share that estimation, but you probably know that the majority of the world's scientists do. And I was sharing with Bill earlier that I look at my Apple News feed every morning, and I look at the New York Times, I look at the Guardian, I look at the news that is coming from around the world. And if you're not looking at this news, but surely you are, and that is that the situation is incredibly dire. Not to depress you this morning, but I mean, in order to understand this question I'm asking, how would we read the Bible for the sake of the planet, we really have to realize how desperate the situation is that we're in. So some of you know that one of the primary Bibles for climate change information is the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You may have heard the news when they came out this spring about the projections and the diagnosis of where we are. It was incredibly dire. I was recently listening to a podcast of one of the scientists that was on this, and actually said it is a very tame It is a very tame report because reports like this have to be agreed to by scientists and politicians. So to get politicians to sign on to it, it was actually made a little tamer than many of the scientists thought. So there's information about this all over the place. If you haven't read the IPCC report, it's a sobering read. But again, just general news, we hear from the United States even that in California, the water crisis has gotten so severe that not only is watering being restricted, but other forms of using water. This particular New York Times article was talking about that's just one of the first big examples of how water restrictions are coming to the United States. If we look around the world, you've heard this too, that the incredible increase in temperatures are making some places almost uninhabitable. 118 degrees Fahrenheit in some places, like Southeast Asia, India, and some of the estimations of already the number of climate refugees, that is, people who've had to leave their spaces through either flooding or heat or tornado and all of that, that millions of people have already relocated based on the changing climate. We see lots of examples in our news. Increased flooding. I don't know what's going on in Derry and in Hershey, but on Monday, there's a projected tornado for Lancaster. So we've seen incredible flooding. An article that I read yesterday is that it is no longer just coastal communities that have to worry about flooding. New York is already planning for flooding far inland because as groundwater rises, right, the flooding comes not just from the ocean, but also up from the ground. If you're keeping up with any of this kind of news, or if you keep up with anything that's going on in the United States, as well as around the world, you also know that not everybody is sharing the brunt of this equally, right? What's being now called environmental racism reminds us that the people who are least able to absorb the problems of the world are getting most of them. That pollution factories are placed in communities of color, in poor communities, where asthma and other problems are done there. And so environmental racism is a major issue around the world. And the poorer a place is, the more likely it doesn't have the resources to adapt. You might even think about during the pandemic, think about who had the financial resources to leave their spaces and go move somewhere else, right? And who didn't. I love this image. It went around the internet for quite a while. It's these guys playing golf while the wildfires are raging in the back. I've often thought of this as kind of like a metaphor for the way that I and other people are living. There's all this going around us, and we play golf, and we go to the beach, and we do that. And so I hope you hear my own frustration, passion, and concern about this, and why I have this question. How do we read the Bible now for the sake of the planet? What does it mean to read the Bible responsibly in this time and place, not forgetting about all the other things that are important, but also not to let this pass us by? I don't know about you, but I have heard within the last 2 years one sermon on the climate crisis. One. I've heard one mention of the climate crisis in anything that I've encountered. That may be different for you, and I hope it is. So here's my plan for today, and then I'll tell you what I'm planning for next week unless you give me other ideas as we go along. It's what I'd like to talk about is the way that people so far have been doing that. So I want to kind of suggest, okay, what are the options? How have people been doing this? What are the strengths of that? What are the weaknesses of that? What's working? What's not working? And then, and I'm going to do that mostly today to talk about like where are we in reading the Bible in the climate crisis. And then next week, I want to get a little bit more creative and talk about what are some alternatives? What are some new ways that people who care about the environment are beginning to bring the Bible and read the Bible in light of current concerns? Hope that works with you. You'll let me know, right? Put it in the chat, right? Tell me in the room. So I was thinking about how to categorize this, and I think I'll describe the first approach is by pitting religion against science. And as an extreme example, I'm going to use the millennialist movement, and I chose this guy because many of us of a certain age remember, right, the original Left Behind series, the late great planet Earth, Hal Lindsey and all that. This is a very clear and for some people familiar example of folks who say that you can't trust science. The Bible tells us all that we need to know. So in a way, the Bible becomes the alternative science book, the real science book against bad science. So you know maybe what I'm talking about. Often associated with fundamentalists or other conservatives is this idea that you can take, and the key text for this approach is Genesis chapter 1. Well, if you read Genesis chapter 1 literally, or mostly literally, you always have to reinterpret something to make it fit your own time period, including great sea monsters. But this approach says that the Bible tells us how the world was created. It was created in 6 days. God's in charge of it. And if you keep reading in the Bible, according to this position, you know that it's not going to last very much longer. So people like Tim LaHaye and some of the other folks who take this position, they really like passages, not only the book of Revelation, but like something like this passage from Mark. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as a branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know summer is here. So when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Early on in my teaching career, I read Tim LaHaye books in chronological order, and I watched how he kept redefining what this generation was on the timeline. His claim is that all the bad things that are happening in this world now, right? All the signs of the times are indicators that Jesus is getting ready to come back soon. So essentially, you don't have to worry about the climate crisis because the world's going away anyway. Right? I just put a footnote. My husband belongs to a group of people who go out to breakfast. They were co-workers from back in the day. And recently, one of the guys at breakfast took him aside and said, I want to give you this app that you can put on your phone, and what you can do is you can put into the app what's going on in the world, and it will give you the countdown to when Jesus is coming back. So I'm going to simplify this just a little bit, that in some ways, extreme flooding, wildfires, earthquakes, tornadoes in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in May, for this perspective, are in some ways good news, because what they show you is that the end is near, and the idea is not to change what's going on, but to prepare one's soul for the coming of Jesus. You know, have you heard this kind of position, right, in that way? Now, I will say that many folks don't identify with this, what they see as a kind of extreme pit the Bible against science or religion against science view, but there still are a lot of people who have a version of this attitude, and that is that God is in charge. We can't really do anything to change the way the world is, and really all humans can do is to prepare our souls for whatever comes in the future. This is, I think, behind many of the views that say, yes, there's much going on in the world, but it's natural, it always happens, and the best thing we can do is to recognize what's happened, know that God is in charge, and adapt in any way that we can. I call this the pit religion against science from a religious standpoint. So religious people who aren't really that interested or convinced by scientific arguments. To be fair though, there's also that pit science against the religion from the science side. So I'll also go back in time a little bit. There was an article written in 1967 by, he's actually a historian, not a scientist, but his name is Lynn White. And Lynn White made this claim in 1967 that a lot of people are still talking about. So you can, if you can see that, the historic roots of our ecologic crisis, and he was talking about this in 1967. And what Lynn White charged was that the reason that we have an ecological crisis is the fault of Judeo-Christian religion, and particularly the attitudes that are baked into the Bible. So just like, it's kind of ironic that just like millennialists go to Genesis chapter 1 to say, see, God's got it in charge, what Lynn White did was to go to Genesis chapter 1 and said, here is the root of the problem. Most of us know that at the end of Genesis 1, that creation story, it kind of culminates, so 6 days creation, and at the last day, the sixth day, that human beings are created. They are created in the image of God, and boy, did Lynn White really capitalize on these verbs. So that humans, according to Lynn White, have been told, or Christians and Jews, but mostly Christians, he was blaming, have these texts that tell them that it's their job not only to multiply, but to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. Lynn White claimed that that is fundamentally the problem underneath the ecologic crisis, is that we've got a religion that teaches people that humans are in charge of the world, and that everything that is on earth is for their benefit. Other scientists, you know, if you read any of these folks, have been, there's a whole strand that's very antagonistic toward religion, who really continue to see Christianity, Judaism, and to the extent they talk about Islam as well, as the root of the problem that keeps people from dealing with the reality of the world. So some of their charges are, let's just say Christians here for a minute. Christians are too passive. They want to leave everything in the hands of God. They don't take responsibility for the world that they have. They see too much of a split between the material world and the spiritual world. They're so worried about their souls that they're not paying attention to their drinking water. So there are a whole host of scientists that are continuing to see religion as the root of the problem. And we're going to talk about some of the passages that they use when we get there next week. I'll just give you previews of coming attraction for next week. There's an artist that I want to talk about next week. His name is Nick Brandt. He uses photography and art to do climate activism. And I had the opportunity to have an email exchange. I asked if he would give me permission to use his art in some of my work, and he said on one condition. He said, if you will explain to me why religious people are the greatest obstacles toward getting any work done for climate change in this world. I said, Nick, I don't think I can meet that criteria. Could I please use your photographs? He, in his work, which I'll show you, is just incredible. Next week in his work in Africa with endangered species, extinct species, trying to do advocacy work, he has found that the greatest opposition to his work comes from religious people. So, this is one way that the Bible becomes a battleground, just like it is for everything else. It becomes a battleground with some positions towards science and religion. Is the Bible good and science bad? Is science good and the Bible bad? Which one's right? Which one's better? How did they go along? Thank goodness that's not the only attitude that people have been using toward using the Bible. And the one I'm going to share now is one that we're probably more familiar with in our settings. I call it the kind of let's love creation attitude. Let's care for creation. Let's work on environmental stewardship. I call this creation theology, where we tend to talk about the care of God's creation. And I just pulled some logos from different religious groups. This is from the Episcopal Church. I do have one from the PCUSA. I'll show you in just a minute. But it's this kind of thinking that part of what it means to be a Christian is to care for the creation that God has given us. So this approach, right, there's even a version of the New Revised Standard Version where, did you ever see the Bibles that put the sayings of Jesus in red letters, like a red letter Bible? What the Green Bible does is put into green anything that deals with the earth. So that's what the Green Bible is. It even has a foreword by Desmond Tutu. This approach loves particular kinds of passages. A great one is Psalm number 8, where God's name is beautiful and majestic in all the work. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? You've made them a little lower than God and crowned them and given them dominion, but with this sense that creation is beautiful, that the heavens are telling the glory of God, and human beings are honored to take care of that. Really like Genesis chapter 1 that talk about how good creation is. Genesis 2, that the humans care for people in the garden. and I thought I'd put up the PCUSA there. I tried to learn more, and I'm hoping some of you can tell me about it, more about the PCUSA's engagement with climate issues, because a lot of what I could find on the internet was from 2018. Right, found a little bit more recent, but most of what I found was from 2018. So I look forward to hearing what you can tell me about. This is, I think, a little bit more common, am I right? Where we sing songs like Morning Has Broken, we talk about loving the earth, caring for the earth, all of that. But maybe I'm gonna sound like a big downer today. I'm gonna suggest that there is increasing criticism, not just of the PCUSA, but of this way of talking about the earth and the current climate change, that are actually challenging some of the ways that Christians have talked about this. They're challenging words like talking about earth as God's creation, and challenging this notion of stewardship. So, with your permission, I want to see if I can explain that a little bit more, and explain why not even all Christians are using language like creation, care, and stewardship anymore. Here's some lovely images. I think about, before I get to the critique, I was thinking about how common this is on Earth Day and Earth Day celebrations in churches, that we have images like earth is our home, care for it, clean up your mess, love your mother. These ways of kind of personalizing the earth and seeing ourselves as responsible for it. But oh yeah, back to my bummer thing. Right. Many Christian ethicists and climate folks are saying that as long as we think about our role on this earth as being stewards of God's creation, it's always going to make human beings be the most important things on the planet. It's going to have what we want to call an anthropocentric view, that everything is for the sake of humans. It's almost this idea that we've been left in charge by an absentee landlord, and this is all ours to decide how the earth would be. They also claim that it kind of understands earth as a natural resource, that we get to decide how it's used. We get to decide how the trees are done. We get to decide how the rivers are taken care of. It assumes that we are the managers of the world. But to me, one of the biggest problems of language like creation, care, and stewardship, it implies that the earth now is the way God created it to be. A lot of folks are suggesting that what's happening is that the world is already so devastated. The planet is already so devastated that this idea of stewardship and management of it is far too light for facing the crisis that we're facing. We're not looking at an undamaged, beautifully created earth, morning has broken. We're looking at devastation, we're looking at flooding, we're looking at really dire predictions. And their claim is, as long as we're thinking that sentimentally about the planet that we live on, we're never going to have the kind of work that we need to do to face the current realities. Told you, get depressed coming to Jerry Presbyterian Sunday School today. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've taken some of this on in my work as a biblical scholar. My own commitment to myself and to the world is I will not do biblical scholarship anymore in a way that doesn't factor in the reality of the planet on which I live. So I even preached my younger brother's installation service as a pastor. And even as we were celebrating his coming to be the leader of this new congregation, we acknowledged the place in which he lived is getting ready to be devastated. He just moved to Virginia Beach, Virginia, whose coastal flooding projections are incredibly dire. Folks in his congregation appreciated that because they said nobody has been talking to us about the reality of the places in which we live. So one of my commitments is that I'm not going to just do this when I come to places like Derry and talk about climate change, but I'm also going to try to build it in to all the other work that I'm going to do. I'm actually right now writing a commentary on the book of Isaiah. Some of you maybe know this series. It's called the Interpretation Commentary Series. It's put out by the Presbyterians. It's meant to help preachers, teachers, lay people understand Isaiah. And I've committed myself that I won't talk about Isaiah without at least asking, what does its way of thinking mean for the world that we really live in? So I will share with you that it was a little sobering to do that. So I'm particularly looking at the second half of the book Isaiah, which ironically is the part that talks about creation and the wonder of God's world. And one of the things that I began to notice over and over again is that whenever Isaiah talks about creation, it always talks about it from a human perspective and how the creation of the world and the Creator benefits human living. So I'm giving you a couple of examples here from Isaiah 44. It sounds great, sounds very creation-y. When you start, I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who by myself spread out the earth. And folks have really latched on to this part of Isaiah as having a creation epic. But what I notice about it, in the very next breath, right? There are there's one verse missing there, I acknowledge. But in the very next breath, it is that the Creator of the world does certain things for certain people. So this God who stretched out the heavens and the earth says of Jerusalem, it shall be inhabited, rebuilt, and raised up. And then it talks about the temple being rebuilt. This passage is probably written at the end of the exile, trying to convince people that God can restore their homes and their temple. But if we're asking the questions about why do we talk about creation and God as a creator, what I began to recognize is that there was always self-interest involved in that. That it is the Creator of the world who creates a space for me, who creates a place for humans on this planet. Here I go. Bill has known me over many years, and he said, you always come and mess things up. Like, you always raise problems with things. So here I go again. At the end of Isaiah is a version of that passage that shows up earlier in Isaiah that we read often at Advent and Christmas time. You know, the wolf will lie down with the lamb. In the early part of Isaiah, it is, and a little child will lead them. Put that there. But notice, and again, this is not my unique insight, others have pointed it out too, but that kind of image of wild animals coming together peacefully, that the wolf and the lamb will feed together and the lion will eat straw like an ox, is an image of nature that is for human benefit. I was really struck when somebody asked me the question, who benefits when the wolf and the lamb feed together? The lamb, for most of biblical history that we know with, are animals that are tended to by humans and financially and food-wise benefit them. And by having the wolf not eat the lamb anymore, it's protecting human resources. The same thing with lions eating straw. This is not what we think of as the natural order, but it is, in an odd way, a disruption of the natural order that benefits some animals over other, and ultimately benefits people, especially those sheep that are in a fold, that are not out running through the land, but are the sheep in a fold. Now, I could go on and on about this, about the things that I found in 2nd Isaiah, that second big chunk of Isaiah, that helped me recognize that things aren't as simple as going to the Bible and saying, where does it talk about God as a creator? Where does it talk about the goodness of creation? Where does it give me images of peaceful nature? But there is a reality that some of those critiques that Lynn White made back in '67 still kind of hold true for me. That there is a way in which I think Christianity and Christian use of the Bible is going to have to change if we're going to do the really hard work of facing the world in which we live. Yeah, I didn't do that. So even though I don't agree with everything that Lynn White said, I do agree with some of what he concluded. That we will continue to have a worsening ecologic crisis until we reject not Christianity, but the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve humans. That he says until we begin to think less about our own safety, our own security, and all of that, we're not going to have any hope of dealing with the world as it is. It was a strategic decision I made today. I don't know if it was a good one or not, is to really talk about some of these previous perspectives, what I see as some of the weaknesses of them, before we can shift next week to talking about some of the alternatives. What are some different ways in which we might hold the reality of the depth of our crisis together with texts that we love and that we care about and bring them together? That's my question for my own life right now. So you can decide if you want to join me with that. What resources can this text provide us to help us face what the world will be facing within the next 20 to 30 years? You've probably heard many of these pretty dire statistics of how the world will look fairly radically different by 2030. And by 2050, many of the places where many of us vacation will be underwater. The Maldives will likely be, I don't know the Maldives, but it'll be underwater. The Keys, really different profiles in DC, New York, other places too. So for me, this is an existential issue that the church can't ignore. And what I would like to do is to have us think together next time about what can these resources offer us. And I'll go ahead and tell you, I think they have a lot to offer us, not just about showing us that the world is good, but they might teach us how to lament, how to deal with climate refugees, and how to behave in times of extreme change and adaptability. So you're probably going to give lots of different alternatives as well as we go along. But I think I'd like to stop there and see what kind of questions, what kind of pushback, what you have to say about this? Folks in the room want to say something? Stuff on people? Yeah, please.
Well, harking back to the beginning of your talk, it was interesting to me that I was in conversation with a neighbor a couple of days ago, and I mentioned what this Sunday school class would be about. And she attends locally, maybe a more fundamentalist congregation, and she immediately assumed that it was going to be about end times. She told me that the Bible talks a lot about, and I could only respond, I don't think so.
Interesting. That's a great example of that way of approaching it.
Right. I didn't expect that, but there it was.
Well, I remember just in my lifetime, never thinking that Antarctica would be in peril. I mean, that was this ice cap that just was always going to be there. It's always been there. It's going to always be there. In the last 10 years, parts as big as Rhode Island have just melted and fallen away. States like Louisiana, Florida, the whole East Coast, the lowlands like lower parts of South Carolina and all, they're going to be flooded. They're just, when we talk about a flood and they're putting houses up on 10 feet, stilts to survive, well, what are they going to do about the roads? How are people going to get around? It just boggles the mind. And we're blithely going along thinking that's going to solve the problem. Just raise your house. Well, it's getting closer to home because we used to vacation every summer on the Outer Banks. And I just watched yesterday or the day before, another house just get washed into the ocean that not many years ago was a very great place to visit, and it wasn't on the ocean, it was sitting inland. And we just blithely go on. Next week they'll build a new one to replace the one that just fell down, as though that's the way life is. And it just, we tend to stick our heads in the sand and continue on thinking it's always going to be the same. And we can make a change. It's just fighting the politics and the mindset. And part of what you said is part of the mindset, interpreting the Bible correctly, not the way you want to, not find the passage that agree with you, but address the other passages in the same open mind.
Yeah, and you know, one of the shifts that I've had to make over the course of my own life with reading the Bible, professionally and otherwise, is, and you don't have to share this conclusion, is that the Bible's not always going to offer the solutions to the things that I'm looking for in the ways that I want it to offer those solutions. So for me, it's been helpful to also point out, and I put it in the category of honesty, of when is the Bible, maybe itself, at least some passages or some ideas that are behind passages, when are they part of the problem? And how do I take responsibility toward acknowledging that and saying those are the parts I'm choosing not to bring forward? Right? So a really honest engagement with that. I think that's a really important point, Bill, that most people don't recognize the problem until it impacts them personally. So when you say it's coming more close to home, but I was having a conversation with somebody in my extended family, and I said something about sea level rise, and the person said, well, why don't those people just move? Like, why do people stay in Louisiana? Why do people stay on the coast? Why do they live there? Again, it's a great arrogance of privilege to assume that everybody has the financial resources to relocate out of unsafe areas, and there are very few safe areas that will be there for very long. Yeah.
I'm part of a Monday night group that started out as a Bible study group of women here at Derry, but without Deb Hogue anymore, we have become a book group, and we've recently read Jane Goodall's book, and then even more recently, Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed, where he pointed out quite clearly that, it's related to the picture of the chemical plant and black people who can't leave because they just can't. They have no way to go. They have no way to move, and they have no resources to make that move. And we talked about, other pockets that are, or at least I mentioned, there's Flint, Michigan. There's probably lots that we don't know about, but those two are very obviously, and that, he was talking about a community in Mississippi, I think.
Yeah, it is striking. I didn't watch it, but you may have seen that there was an Oprah special. Was that last week or whatever? But the promos were using the statistic that's pretty widely shared. The biggest indicator of your longevity is your zip code. So where you live, both environmentally and otherwise, is one of the better indicators of your health in that way. So it's easy to blame personal choices for certain kind of health behaviors, but those are always influenced by a context in which people live. Now, I do think this notion of environmental refugees is a major issue that is facing the world in the next 20 to 30 years. And we all know the great debates about refugees in general. What are legitimate reasons to accept people as refugees? And what does that mean as people move in light of climate crisis as well as political crisis? And we already know that there are different levels of welcome depending on where you come from and other factors. Other thoughts? I do want to point ahead to some good news for next week. And that is that there has been a major change in the evangelical movement, or at least maybe not fundamentalism, but there are evangelicals for climate change. So we're going to talk a little bit about their kind of work, what they're doing. We're going to talk about other ways in which folks are trying to read text differently, how they're trying to work differently within the environment in which they live. So we're going to look at how folks are continuing to do the task of critique, but also reconstruction in ways that are very powerful and reclaiming texts that we don't normally see as hopeful, even the book of Leviticus, that are very grounded in bodies and recognizing the importance of what it means to pay attention to one's body in relationship to God and God's world. So we'll do that. We're a little bit early today. Is that okay that we end, Bill, or do we want to keep going? Anything?
That's fine
Did you
if there are no further questions. I
Great.
don't see anybody here. So,
Good.
No, I think it's been great.
Well, good.
Thank
We'll
you.
see. I'll see some of you next week, right?
Thank
Thanks,
you.
and bye
Thank you.
everybody on the screen.